It's time to speak to Neil Oliver, of course, the host of Coast. I've never said that before, actually. Neil, a very good morning to you.
Morning, mate. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. I was very encouraged when I read your piece. I didn't get around to it. It's funny, how the weekend goes. I find myself reading your Sunday Times piece usually on Monday, but for some reason I missed it until Tuesday this week. But it was a great piece about how terribly awful TV news has become, and how, like me, you kind of became slightly addicted to TV news in your kind of teenage years because your parents were always watching it and you wondered why they were doing that. But it is awful, isn't it, that we have come to this point in journalism where you really can't trust anything they say anymore.
Yeah, it's not just me, I'd have to say. I mean, obviously, the piece in the Sunday Times was my opinion, but I did base it on the kind of straw poll that every one of us is able to do based on what they hear from the friends, the neighbours, casual encounters that you have in the street. And so many people of all ages and all parts of the demographic are saying to me they just can't bear the news. And they mean the news on the television. And it's a great loss and a sadness to me. I trained as a journalist. I worked in newspapers, as you did. And, one of the great joys in newspapers, if you work in newspapers, is the offices were always full of every newspaper under the sun. So you read right across the board, and you knew that newspapers were partisan.
Yeah.
The Mirror was Labour, and so was the Guardian, and the Telegraph was Conservative, and so on. And you could read right across the gamut, and it was fun. But the television news, in my mind, always played the role of like umpire or referee.
Yes.
It adopted a position of having no position. And you kind of went to the news just to get information reported in the best possible sense of the word, in a kind of a bland fashion. It was a kind of a vanilla magnolia paint colour version of events. And you weren't really, a great game would have been to try and guess, what opinion a newscaster might have had, because they were so careful in never seeming to declare a loyalty one way or another.
Right.
And the television news for me played a very, very specific and important role. But now I've just become aware that it's become as partisan as any other delivery system of information. And I just find I don't want that from that medium.
No.
And increasingly, I just don't watch it.
But the trouble is as well, Neil, that unlike the Telegraph and the Guardian and the Mirror and the Sun and the Mail and all of the things that you knew about those newspapers just by looking at them, the television news still attempts to make out that it is in fact neutral. So they don't tell you that they're going to be biased. They don't tell you that they're going to be coming at a story from a particular angle. They just expect you to think that that is the way the story should be told.
Yes, I think that is the problem. And in so many ways, I think some media are being left behind by reality. Audiences are getting increasingly sophisticated, and you sometimes get the impression that, say in the case of television news, they still think that they're getting away with being impartial, as coming across as impartial, while plainly not. Well, plainly being very partial and partisan.
Right.
They're trying to be both things at the same time, and they've been rumbled long ago.
Right. Well, I'm even just looking at a story this morning in the papers, which I'm sure years ago, and I don't want to age myself too much, but in the years of sort of Cliff Mitchell and people like that who used to read the news, and even Jan Leeming, who was relatively straightforward on the BBC. We've got Naga Munchetti in the papers again today. She's been warned of a conflict of interest because she's been paid to be in a campaign for NatWest. Now, I'm sorry, if you're a journalist, I mean, if NatWest came to me and said, we'd like to pay you 100,000 quid to do an advert voiceover for us, I'd say no. And the reason I'd say no is because the next time there's a story about NatWest, I would feel funny about slagging them off. And that's why I don't want their money.
That's right. That seems very plain.
Yeah.
In that role, that your unbiased credentials have to be beyond challenge.
Yeah.
You have to be able to credibly say that you don't have any vested interest in any of the key players or moving parts in any news story that might happen now or in the future. And you're obviously compromised as a journalist before you open your mouth.
Yeah.
If you're in the pay of whoever.
Yes.
The audience could not be expected to trust that you would be impartial
No.
in a story that might paint one of your sponsors in a bad light.
Right. Although I come from the old school, and I had a very good friend who was one of the great foreign correspondents in New York at the time, a guy called George Gordon, who I learned an awful lot from. He was a Daily Mail foreign correspondent. He got a call once from the PR at Cunard, because Cunard used to bring the QE2 into, obviously, New York quite regularly, and they would take all the journos out on a little voyage out into international waters, throw money at them and let us gamble and drink and do all the things that journalists like to do. And he got a call from this woman, right, who said, we're a bit upset today at Cunard because the Mail today has splashed on a story that, it is not very friendly to us. She said, since we last took you out, we've only had 3 stories in the paper. The first one was about how you were refitting the engines in Germany instead of in Britain. The second one was about some kind of an engine stall in the middle of the Atlantic. And this morning's story is that the head chef of the Cunard ship has got AIDS. And he said, well, imagine what it would have been like if you hadn't given me the freebie.
Well, yeah. The impartiality, that's all I'm asking for. Yeah. Newspaper journalism is a multicolored beast. Of course it is. And I think we're all sophisticated enough to know that we can go to all sorts of different sources now, hundreds, thousands of different sources, if we want to hear opinion. Yeah. And sometimes you want to hear an opinion you agree with, so that you can so that you can enjoy it. And sometimes you want to have to hear someone say something that gets your gears grinding, because that can be interesting as well, just to hear the opposing view. But there has to be, especially in times of crisis. I mean, I think what's brought my frustration with the television news to a head is that we're in a time that you might justifiably describe as national crisis, with lockdown and the pandemic and everything else that's going on at the moment. And at a time like that, you need unifying forces. I think you need certain points in the environment that people can gather around and feel united and have a common sense of purpose. And the television news, should be something that people can just stop everything, take a minute, and just feel as if they've caught up with some unbiased coverage. And it's part of the society moving forward as one. But the universal partisanship is just increasing the divisions between people. And I just have this awful sense of us being trapped, unable to move constructively in any direction, because half of the oars on the boat are pulling one way and the oars on the other side of the ship are pulling the other. And we're just going round and round in circles. And the constant division is perpetuating that situation. And we can see it, here, every decision that we seem to be asked to make as a population seems to be quite close. It always seems to be around the sort of 50-50 mark, Brexit and the rest of it. The same thing's happening in North America. They seem to split 50-50 between the Democrats and the Republicans election after election. And there's a sense, because of that 50-50 split, in which no one, it doesn't matter who wins or who's got the tiny majority at any given moment, because the other side are pushing so hard or pulling so hard against wherever the majority want to go, that there's this terrible stasis. And at a time like this, when we're facing a war, if you like, we're at war with COVID-19. Yeah. That is the perceived enemy. And we need to be united. We need something to pull us together. And I would have thought it would have been a perfect time for the television news to take that role of trying to pull everyone together. And instead, it seems very effectively to just be increasing the atmosphere of division.
Sure.
And,
well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, it was only a couple of weeks ago that the news broke, and in fact, it was the front page of the Mail on Sunday, that there's 2, one of them emanating from inside this building. There's 2 possible new TV channels starting up, which will have a sort of right of centre direction, if you like. But I wonder whether the reason for... Because it used to be that you'd watch the TV news for sort of footage of stuff, wouldn't you? You'd watch TV news because they would have the film of what was something terrible happening in Burma or in Rangoon or in Hong Kong, and you would see the video footage. But now it seems to be personality-led, and it's sort of personality journalism, and I wonder if that's the change.
Yes, I do think there's definitely a part of the truth in that, because you have to buy into you have to like the person or not, because on a daily basis you're hearing their opinions. Yeah. And so you have to find some accord, or you have to be the kind of person that likes shouting at the screen all the time. Right. And I'm not one of those people. I just can't be bothered with it. And so because nowadays, with so much of the news, it's so you can so quickly discern what way someone is facing politically or their opinion on any given matter, that if it doesn't chime with mine, I just tend to think, oh, well, if it's opinion I'm after, I can get it somewhere else. Right. I don't need to get it here as well.
Right. But also, do you not find it fascinating in a way that, I mean, you've also, there's a piece in the Mail this weekend as well about your kind of constant battles at the moment with various issues in Scotland, you know, the hate bill, the hate speech bill, which is coming through, your defence of and or kind of, musings on Boris Johnson and on the State of the Union and all of that. And it does feel, I mean, I know exactly what you mean when you say you feel as if you're in the First World War trenches, sort of genuinely fighting people off all the time.
And I've got, for some reason, I've discovered within myself really that I didn't know was there, some kind of stubbornness that I hadn't really hitherto appreciated. I took a great deal of, I've watched a few times, I'm sure you saw it as well, there was a clip on YouTube and whatever of one of the, a restaurant outside, people sitting outside a restaurant in one of the troubled American cities. Yes. I don't know if it was Kenosha or Minneapolis. Yeah. And Black Lives Matter protesters were haranguing people sitting at tables and trying to force them to raise their fists into the
Black Power salute thing. Yeah.
And most of all of the visible customers were cowed and had raised their hands because there was a mob of most white people, as it happened, screaming into the faces of these patrons of these restaurants. But there was a woman in a pink blouse or a pink shirt who was steadfastly refusing to raise her fist. And for the duration of the footage, she didn't raise her fist. And I thought, be that woman.
Yes. No, absolutely.
And I took great heart from it, because there are times when it doesn't, more important really than what it is that a mob is shouting, even if the mob were right, hypothetically, if they're using shouting and threats of violence to get their opinion across, then the only response is to refuse to buckle.
Yes. Well, I like that scene. It's like that scene in Midnight Express, when he goes into that room and they're all walking around the pillar and they're only doing it in one direction. He starts walking in the other direction. That's me. That's what I'd be doing.
So I've discovered, because I, inadvertently and naively, I suppose, wandered into territory where I had a contrary view to a lot of outspoken other people. I've found myself being shouted at, mostly metaphorically speaking. I mean, 99% of it is keyboard heroes, but I'm being shouted at in some way. And I think, no, if there is one thing that I will not submit to, it's being yelled at.
Right.
I don't care what the opinion is. If it's being shouted at me and if it's being reinforced by threats of violence, real or imagined, my only position that I have to adopt is to say no. I will resist that push.
Yeah.
With all available strength that I have. So I'm in this kind of, I use this sort of analogy of Ypres Salient and the war of attrition, because I don't see any way out of it. If I continue to be shouted at, I'll just have to keep on doing what I've been doing. And it's obviously wearing, and I'm sort of bored with the whole thing and I'd like to move on.
Yeah.
But as long as I keep on as long as large numbers of people keep on insisting that I change my views or shut up, then I won't change my views. I won't shut up.
No, I know there's a certain sort of cussedness, as my mother would call it, which is, I think, a fairly Scottish trait, to be honest, which I definitely have, and which is very almost addictive in its own way, because while, like you, I occasionally think, do you know what, I just can't be bothered, and I'll put the phone down for a while and just leave it, especially at the weekends if I'm with the kids. I'm just like, I'm not going to get involved. But, it's quite tempting to just give it back to them, because you just think, who the hell do you think you are, telling me this or telling me that or calling me this name or hurling this abuse at me? I don't believe that you have the right to do that without me coming back at you.
It's quite interesting when you consider your own personality under those circumstances, because you kind of come to realise that the inside of your head or your personality is populated by more than one character, in a sense.
Yeah.
And it's like these people with multiple personality syndrome. It appears that it's only when you get put into a certain circumstance or a certain set of circumstances that suddenly, out of nowhere, a character almost like a different character in a novel, suddenly comes centre stage, and you hadn't previously known that you were inhabited by that person. And so I have found this character inside myself as a response to these the circumstances in which I found myself, and I find that quite fascinating. I would never have known that I had this trait if I hadn't blundered haplessly into this political and culture war. But as it turns out, I have somebody living inside me who just won't shut up and just won't stop.
Well, also, it shouldn't be forgotten, have some pretty decent causes to fight for, because, you are still in the midst of this hate crime bill. And interestingly enough, talking about, say, the coverage of TV news, I mean, I know enough about Scotland to know that the media in Scotland is far more partisan, in a way, politically, than the media in England is. In terms of, what they write about. Have you lost me?
I've lost you at the moment, Mike.
Oh, okay. So Neil can't hear me at the moment. We'll come back to him. I mean, what I was basically saying is that we know, for example, there's a newspaper called The National, which is published by the Glasgow Herald Group, which should actually, to all intents and purposes, be a proper newspaper. But it turns out that it's not a proper newspaper. It is, in fact, a sort of a hymn sheet for the SNP, and all it does really is promote the SNP's views. And every time, in fact, you've appeared in the pages of The National, I think, Neil, after being on this show, haven't you?
All the time. The National, yes, I appear. Well, I don't know. I don't see it. In fact, I think it's got a very small circulation, I believe.
Yeah.
But as far as newspapers go, it's more like a newspaper that's had one too many baby shams at a party, and she's really just its heads. It's gone beyond the point of reason, and there's really not much more point in it hanging around until it's had a good night's sleep. And yes, I have suffered the brickbats of their attention, but that it's just part and parcel of the political situation. That's it's obviously I'm very affected about what's going on in Scotland, but it's across the board. It's just so high-tempered at the moment, and that's why, to get back to how our conversation started this morning, there needs to be some kind of calming, sober voice in the midst of it all, where regardless of your particular opinions or point of view, that you can just go to almost like the, hear ye, speaker in the town square. You just need to be able to rely on getting some up-to-date, unopinionated information that lets you feel as if you're keeping up with the state of play and the state of the nation, without having to worry at the same time about the motivations of the people who are giving you that. Otherwise we start to stray into the territory of agitprop. Where political propaganda is pushed out to the people via the popular media, and agitprop is a tactic that everyone associates with, Soviet Russia. Yeah, it's hardly a state of affairs that you would think that anybody would want to import into a 21st century Western democracy.
No, but interesting as well, isn't it, that there's a view currently being held, certainly in Westminster, by the lobby hacks, that basically Dominic Cummings has kind of led Downing Street further and further away from what he would regard as consultation with any journalist, doesn't really care about journalists at all. And so they basically get their messages out a variety of different ways, which then leaves the journalists to kind of have to come up with their own stuff.
Yes, and I think another I'm not even going to call it, I'm not going to categorise it as a danger. I think it's just a fact of life. What the mainstream media don't seem to be accepting effectively enough is that there are a myriad spectrum of other sources of information, and quite often, things that are online and whatever, they're often characterised as conspiracy theory or downright lunacy, and they're derided and refuted in all sorts of ways. But be that as it may, even if that were true, and I'm certainly not saying that all the information that's available online is fake news, and not at all. I don't believe that. I think there's a lot of good sources of information out there, but it remains the case that, as far as I can tell, people are being driven more and more away from any sort of terrestrial unifying popular media into the online options. and people are those audiences are growing exponentially, and that's just a fact. And what it means is that a lot of the traditional sources of information are now becoming irrelevant. I don't know what the audience figures are, but I can only imagine that across the board in terrestrial news, I assume they're going down.
They're not very good. I can tell you that for a fact.
And other sources of information are becoming increasingly popular. And I am assembling for myself, as I'm sure many people are, sets of podcasts, people online, people where there seem to be these long-form conversations where people of all sorts of political and religious creeds and colours seem to be invited to come together and have long, calm, sober conversations. And I'm going increasingly to them.
Yes.
And it's not by any means because I agree with everything that I'm hearing. It's because in the context in which those people speak, you see that they're being listened to, and they're all being given equal credibility. And what a big problem that I have with so much of the terrestrial television news is that they suggest that they're having a panel of people, but you know right away that one or two have the same opinion as the newscasters or the presenters, and they are introduced and taken more seriously. And invariably, even in the way in which the other people are introduced, you can tell that they're being teed up as the characters that are going to be knocked down by the presenter and other people on the panel as the conversation goes on.
Right.
They're almost as if they've been brought in just to be knocked down.
Yes.
And it has affected the debate over, say, climate change, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. Always seem to get an easier time in terms of the way that protests are policed and looked after out in the public domain, and then their spokespeople tend to be allowed to dominate the debate, and anyone who has a contrary view is set up as a crank and a denier.
Right.
And that's not any basis for debate and conversation going on, because you can't. We're in this situation all the time now where people are being called stupid for having a contrary point of view away from what the terrestrial media seems to regard as the right opinion. And it simply doesn't work to call people stupid.
No.
Even if people are stupid, you're not going to get anywhere by calling them stupid.
No, I find it much better to let them speak and prove that they're stupid, in actual fact.